All right, if we could begin. Does anybody have any questions that they want to ask before I begin my lecture? I will be saying a few words about your paper because I've gotten a couple of emails what is expected. But before I get into that, any questions up till this point in time? Are you all able to access the material? Yeah, and you've seen the revisions to the syllabus. They're not considerable, but there are a few revisions, right? So the syllabus that you have online is now the current syllabus, and there are going to be no further changes. I may put optional readings. I may add those, to the syllabus at some point. But what you have in the syllabus is what you're accountable for. All right. So a couple of words about the paper. As I said, a couple of students have expressed, a concern about what exactly is expected. Well, what you're going to do is you're going to take one of these films, which is mentioned on the syllabus. You can, by the way, write on 2 films. You don't have to write on 1 film. You could even write on 3. I think that if you try to delve into more than 2 films in a 5-page paper, you're going to just end up, saying things that are pretty cliched, right? So I wouldn't recommend that you do that. I would recommend that you stick to 1 film, at most 2 films. Let's take, for example, a film called Baji on the Beach, right? I don't know, has anybody here seen that film? So there are a couple of you, 3 or 4 if you've seen that film. So, this film revolves around a number of South Asian women who decide to, so it's set in Britain, South Asian women who decide to go to the sea, for a day's outing, right? And they belong to different generations, different stratas of life. One question you might ask, by the way, is, the film's representation of these women, other than in the most obvious ways. For example, one of the women characters here has been going out with a white man, right? With a colored man. And there's a sexual liaison here. Now, this kind of question wouldn't arise in India itself. It may arise with respect to a woman or a man going out with somebody from a different caste background, a different class background. But obviously, there's a racial component, right? And this is what would distinguish the diasporic setting from the setting in India. Because a question that you could logically ask is that, well, what it says about South Asian women in Britain, how is it dramatically different than anything that the filmmaker might say about South Asian women back in South Asia itself, right? Right. So So in other words, the first question to ask is, what is exactly diasporic about this setting? Again, other than the fact that it's set in Britain, so there's obviously a difference in physical location. Other than, let's say, the racial component, and I don't want to minimize that. So someone might well object and say, well, when you say other than, it sounds like it's not a major part of the film. Well, it is in many ways. The question of race is obviously central, as it is to many of these films. Not to all of them, but certainly to many of the films. And when we see My Beautiful Laundrette, the question of race is quite critical, as is a question of sexual orientation, right? So the first way to get a grip on the film, or any one of these other films, is to think about what is really the diasporic setting about. How does it alter our understanding of some of these relationships, which are relationships that one would encounter in any kind of social situation, whether it happens to be Britain or India or the US or anywhere else for that matter, right? And then if you start to delve into these questions further, then we're going to get into questions such as, well, what is the nature of sexual freedom, especially, let's say, for women in the diaspora? Because the argument would be, the traditional argument, we don't have to accept the argument at prima facie, but traditionally the argument would be that, well, women would be much more constrained in a traditional culture, right, such as India, as opposed to Britain. So now here's a second question that you could look at, and that question would be, how does the notion of tradition, right, play out in the diasporic setting? Right? Are there constraints upon these characters, especially women? And again, I say especially women because the argument would be that, well, there would be more constraints upon the conduct of women than there would be upon the conduct of men, which is not to say that there may not be any expectations that a culture might traditionally have of its men. Right? I'm not suggesting that either. But what I'm suggesting is, and I'm giving you a second angle, and that second angle is, how does the idea of tradition work in the diasporic setting, right? Why is it that women, and now here's a subset of that question, why is it that women may have to play the greater role of being carriers of that tradition, right? And does that become enhanced in the diasporic setting? Because the argument, by the way, in most cultures is that women are the carriers of something that is called culture, right? But does this argument get enhanced in the diasporic setting? And if so, in what ways? Right, so here are just some illustrations on how you would go about trying to construct an argument. All right? And I don't want to say much more because I'm going to end up having to write a paper essentially for you. So I'm just giving you some clues as to how you would try to get a grip on some of these questions. All right? I'll take your question in just a second. And let me just end by saying that, look, 5 to 6 pages, you'll get more precise instructions, in an email either this week or next week. But for example, which font you should use, it is mentioned in the in the syllabus actually. So if you read the syllabus, it's very clear what you should be doing. But you should use Times New Roman 12, which is a standard academic font. Don't use Courier because Courier is much broader, and you can tell right away. So 5 pages of Courier are equivalent to 3.5 pages of Times New Roman 12. All right. So you're going to use Times New Roman 12. Do I expect you to use outside sources? Do I expect you to look up reviews of the film? No. Now, if you do, that's fine, right? You might be stumped for some ideas, and you might want to go to some reviews, some secondary literature, right? But if you're borrowing somebody's ideas, then you should acknowledge that in the paper, right? And that's what footnotes are for. They're not simply to cite sources, but to acknowledge where you may have gotten a certain idea from. All right? Your paper should not be littered with footnotes. You really don't need very many. It's a 5-page paper. You don't even need any footnotes, frankly, if you're not using outside sources at all. If you're using some of the readings from the syllabus, then you do not need to give me an elaborate footnote, because all you need to say is Madhvi Kale. Okay, so that's one of the readings for this week. So let's say this is your sentence. The sentence ends here, and you just say Madhvi Kale. You don't even have to say Madhvi because there's only one Kale reading here, right? Page, let's say 85. That's it. As simple as that, Okay, but if you're using outside sources, then you're going to use what is called the Chicago Manual of Style. Go online, and you'll find a short guide to what is called the Chicago Manual of Style. That is one of the 2 standard formats that is used for citations in academic work. The other one, of course, is the MLA style sheet. But we're going to use the Chicago Manual of Style. All right? Question?
Just what is the paper due?
It's mentioned on the syllabus. I don't remember the date. Yeah. If you just look up the syllabus, you'll find the due date and all of that information over there. Any further questions about the paper? Okay. Now, before I begin the lectures, the 2 lectures for this week, and this week we're going to concentrate on the Indian indentured labor system, right, which commenced, as we're going to find out, in the 1830s and ends formally in 1917. In some respects, it still continues if you're looking at the Gulf countries. It's not, of course, the same thing, but if you're looking at the pattern of what is called labor migration, then there's no question that some form of that Indian indentured labor system, without those contracts that you had in precisely the same fashion, right? That system is there, but obviously only confined to certain kinds of labor markets. But before I get to that, what I want to do is I want to very briefly reiterate what I mentioned in the previous class, just so that you remember where we stopped. And there was a 4th point that I wanted to add to my discussion before I move to the system of Indian indentured labor. So I had mentioned to you in my preceding lecture that, look, if we're doing this broad overview, the first set of questions is, what are the different strands or waves of migration? Right? And I gave you a whole narrative of that, commencing with ancient India, coming down nearly to the present day. Secondly, what are the conceptual themes or processes by which one understands the diaspora? Right? So this is a bit more of what you might call a sociological account. Right? That is, we begin with the phenomenon of something called migration, departure, the middle passage, the arrival, and then when we get to the arrival, then we start looking at such things as acculturation, transformation, so forth and so on. Right? Thirdly, what is the nature of Indian culture in the diaspora? Has it created new hybrid forms of literature and music? I gave a couple of illustrations. Chutney music, for example, from the Caribbean. Right? This is a new hybrid form. Many of the most well-known writers in English in the world today are Indian diasporic writers. Good example, of course, would be Salman Rushdie. Very controversial figure, as some of you might know. Right? Another good example would be Amitav Ghosh. And these are some of the leading writers in the English language today, and these are Indian diasporic writers. There's also a new strand of Pakistani writing, but since we're really not looking, as I said, at South Asian diaspora as a whole, but really at Indians, we're not, I'm not mentioning the names over there. Then, of course, we could look at such things as cricket. How did the game of cricket get transformed? Right? It's taken from Britain to India. It's a much greater passion in India than it is in Britain today. A friend of mine once wrote a book called The Tao of Cricket, where he begins by saying that cricket is, in fact, an Indian game accidentally discovered by the British. Right? So, there are all kinds of interesting things that one can do with such things. And then I had mentioned to you the whole question of landscapes. Right? How do landscapes get transformed? The naming of streets. Right? So when, for example, people arrive from India in Trinidad, in Guyana, in Suriname, right? How do they make this environment hospitable to them, familiar to themselves? Right? These are some of the questions that we would have to look at, and we will look at them obviously in greater detail when we look at these questions, sometime in the middle of the quarter. And then the fourth question that I didn't get into, but I had hinted at it, and this is what I want to talk about a little bit before I move to indentured labor, and that is a position of Indians around the diaspora. Now, I had hinted it by suggesting to you in my closing remarks that one could look, for example, at Dubai, right, where there's a very substantial Indian population stripped of anything that we might call the rights of citizenship. In fact, we're going to have to re-theorize what citizenship means once we begin to really look at Indians in the Dubai. And towards the end of this quarter, there's a reading that we have there which focuses on these Indians in Dubai and more generally in the Gulf region, right, in the Gulf states. Now, in some of these places where you have an Indian presence, the politics was highly, highly racialized. Three good examples of that would be Fiji, Trinidad, and Guyana. So in Trinidad, you have an absolute divide between the Afro-Trinidadians and the Indo-Trinidadians. And each of them votes in certain predictable ways because they're two dominant political parties, right? And the vote block is almost entirely based upon what your ethnic racial identity is, right? Same thing in Guyana. And remember that here the setting is largely similar. It's largely similar because both of these are Caribbean colonies, right? And in both of them, what you had was the abolition of slavery, which then led to the migration of Indian indentured labor. Right? Now, Fiji, you had an ethnic Fijian population, an indigenous Fijian population, right? And one way to think about this is to think about what was the position of the colonial state. Okay, so let me flesh it out by giving you an example from Malaysia. Very recently, a group called HINDRAF. Okay, so this group was formed in 2006, and it stands for Hindu Rights Action Force. So that's the acronym, Hindu Rights Action Force. It's an umbrella group made up of somewhere between 30 to 40 NGOs, right, non-governmental organizations. The population of Indians in Malaysia is approximately 8%. Well, it's gone down to a little over 7% right now, but it has been 8%. The historic high would have been about 12 to 14%. Okay, and that would have been before independence. Before independence, approximately 12 to 14%. And now, as I said, down to about between 7 to 8%. Okay, now the Hindu Rights Action Force in 2007 filed a 5.5 trillion, not million or billion, trillion lawsuit. Of course, it's not going to be accepted in the courts. A $5.5 trillion class action lawsuit against the British government for having exploited the Indians for 150 years. This is what the lawsuit claims. Of course, they don't reasonably expect, as I said, that the lawsuit will ever be, even heard, much less adjudicated, even partially, even symbolically in the favor of Hindraf or the Indian community. Now, what is the relevance of this? Because remember, what is the context that I'm describing is what is the position of Indians in these diasporic settings, and I'm saying it varies very considerably from country to country. So, for example, in the United States, the Indians are highly affluent, highly educated, right? Now, in Malaysia, if you read the manifestos produced by Hindraf, so they produce an annual report. It's called Human Rights Violations Against Indians in Malaysia. It's an annual report. They're mimicking the State Department report. The United States State Department issues an annual report about human rights violations around the world, because the US, of course, believes that it's sort of the policeman, and that they're going to tell each country what are your human rights violations. So what Hindraf does now is they're mimicking this report, so they're issuing their report about human rights violations against Indians in Malaysia. It's an annual report, and if you just type in Hindraf 2010 annual report, 2009, whatever, in Google, it'll come up right away. Okay? Now, one of the things that Hindraf states at the outset of this report is that, look, Indians elsewhere in the world are doing splendidly, which is not entirely accurate, because there are some other countries as well where they're not doing too well, but of course Hindraf has in mind Indians in Canada, Australia, the US, where they are doing very well, on the whole. Right? And it's saying that they're doing extremely poorly in Malaysia. So for example, in the USA, Indians are part of what is called a model minority, okay? Which has a complicated politics. We'll get to that much later on. What is a model minority? Right? What does that mean in any case? In Malaysia, on the other hand, the Indians account for the bulk of the criminals and the prisoners, even though they constitute 8% of the population. Now that's a huge variation right? Okay, from the US to Malaysia. And so Hindraf begins by that and saying that, well, the one reason we have this problem is because of the historical conditions under which Indians were brought to Malaysia, and their treatment in the colonial period, and then their treatment in the aftermath of independence. Because when Malaysia in the 1950s became free, okay, so there was a Malaysian Federation that was formed in the 1950s, there was an implicit social pact, implicit, not explicit, implicit social pact that was agreed upon at that time. The pact that was agreed upon at that time was you had three major groups, ethnic groups in Malaysia. So you had the indigenous Malay. The indigenous Malay, who constituted roughly 54% of the population at that time. Then you had the Chinese, who constituted approximately 25 to 28% of the population. And then you had the Indians, who constituted approximately 12% of the population at that time. Okay? So the implicit social pact was that the Indians and Chinese would get citizenship, and in return, the Malays would get privileged access to government jobs, university education, and so on. So if you think about it, you see what's happening here. This is affirmative action, not for a minority, but for the majority. Right? Affirmative action for the majority, in effect. That's what they... And why should the Indians and the Chinese be a party to this implicit social pact? Because the implication is that, well, they're not the indigenous people, so if they get citizenship, a favor is being done to them. But of course, the Indians did not come to Malaysia voluntarily. Right? In other words, there was an indentured labor system. Now, if the Indians have been there for 6 generations, are they indigenous or not, in some sense of the term? Or are we simply going to view them as foreigners? How many generations does an ethnic group have to be in a country before they cease to be viewed as, quote, foreigners? Right? See, these are interesting ways to think about it. That's what I'm trying to suggest to you now. So that if we look at the position of Indians in the diaspora, it's going to vary very considerably, right? And there are some places, in Malaysia, Indians have not been evicted, but there were some places from where Indians were, in fact, actually evicted. One of the films that you have is a film called Mississippi Masala, right? I strongly urge you to see that film, because it's also one of Meera Nair's better films. She's been making films, quite a few of them in recent years, but her early films, in fact, are actually much more successful. And Mississippi Masala, the setting for that is an Indian family that's come from East Africa, been thrown out of East Africa, right? And then they run a motel in the United States, okay? And we will get into the circumstances under which these Indians were evicted later on when we get to the appropriate section, but just to give you an idea of what we're talking about, population estimates. So, for example, in 1969, out of a total population of 13 million in Uganda, there were about 75,000 Indians. 75,000. In 1972, there were 1,000. Okay, 1,000. So nearly the entire population had been evicted. In Tanzania, out of a total population of 19 million, the population declined from 85,000 to 52,000, and by 1984 had declined further to 30,000. And in Kenya, out of a population of 17 million, it declined from 139,000 in 1969 to 50,000 in 1984. Right? So we're talking about precipitous declines. Nowhere more so, of course, than in Uganda, where Idi Amin was the dictator and had certain ideas about how he was going to rejuvenate Uganda without the Asians. All right, so this is going to be a broad set of considerations that you want to keep in mind as we move along and over the course of the next 8 or 10 weeks. Let me now get to the system of indentured labor, but add one remark by way of a preface. One other way that one could do an interesting history of the Indian diaspora, okay, is to take some lives, okay, and then spin a narrative around these lives. So, for example, let's supposing I asked you, well, name me 10 Indians from the diasporic setting. They don't have to be alive today, right? Who you think have been people of considerable consequence, or whose lives have been interesting. Okay? Now, who would you think of? Right? So some people might think of writers, some people might think of, let's say, Meera Nair, the filmmaker, or Gurinder Chadha, the other filmmaker, the woman who made Bend It Like Beckham, right? Some of you might think of that. Some of you might think perhaps of some wealthy Indians who've been living in the diaspora. But there would be interesting ways. Now, I mention this because, there are different ways in which one spins out historical narratives. And one way in which one spins out historical narratives is to take a microhistory and then try to understand what are the different ways in which this microhistory leads us to other kinds of narratives. A very good illustration, a figure that I've been interested in for a very long period of time. And there's one interesting book that has been done by Michael Fisher, is a man called Deen Mohammed. Okay? And who was Deen Mohammed? So Deen Mohammed was an Indian who migrated to Britain, okay, around 1800, and established the first Indian restaurant in Britain in 1810. So that's about a little over 200 years ago, called the Hindustani Coffee House. But more than that, you'll be astonished to know, and this is a little piece of cultural history that's really quite interesting. You'll be astonished to know that it is Deen Mohammed who introduced the practice of shampooing your hair to the West. Well, entirely unknown in the West. Entirely unknown. Right? So he, in fact, actually established a sort of a company. It's called Mohammed Steam and Vapor Sea Water Medicated Baths. Right? And eventually, by the way, he's going to become the official shampooer to George IV, the King of England. Right? So, these are very interesting histories. How did he come to Britain, And the word, by the way, for shampooing is champi. That's the word, so, you'll find it in Hindi films. But initially, this is how it was known, incidentally. So again, you have to go to the Oxford English Dictionary and they'll tell you, the history of this word and how it was first introduced and when this practice first started, so forth and so on. Now, I think that this is an extraordinarily interesting life, right? Because, as I said, then from this narrative, there are so many other narratives. So one narrative would be, well, what strand of migration did he belong to? What strata of life did he belong to? What were the circumstances under which he came to Britain? How was he received? Now, clearly he alters, in some respects, the cultural history of the West. Because shampooing has become, of course, exceedingly common. I mean, there are even dog shampoos now, as I found out once I started keeping a dog. Right? So forth and so on. Right? So this might be one way to write a history of the diaspora. And occasionally I will allude to various lives like these which I think are worthy of our attention. All right, let me get then to the subject of Indian indentured labor. The first thing to consider there is what was happening in India itself. I mean, in other words, if we have this system whereby a large number of people are going to leave India beginning in 1820. Now, I had mentioned to you 1834, which is the beginning of Indian indentured labor as a system, really, to British colonies. The first group of Indians actually that leave India to work as Indian indentured laborers is not to a British colony, but rather to the French Indian Ocean island Reunion. Okay, and in the 1820s you had a number of Indians. In fact, I think a few thousand over a period of several years that are going to leave India and go to this island. Okay, but usually when you speak of a system of Indian indentured labor, most people begin in 1834. 1834 is when slavery was abolished, and this is when the first ships are going to begin to leave India, okay, and they're going to leave for places such as Demerara. Demerara is Jamaica, okay, and Trinidad, and so on, and Mauritius, right? Mauritius is in fact the first place, and then they're going to leave for places in the Caribbean, right? And we're talking about, as I said, very substantial numbers. I'm going to give you the numbers in just a moment, but before we get to that, what we're interested in is, well, what were the circumstances, not so much even of how they left, right? How were they recruited? What was the incentive given to them to leave, right? Did they know where they were going? What strata of life did they come from? But before we get to those very detailed questions, we're interested in the broader socio-economic picture. What was happening in India in the first half of the 19th century? Now, India has been under colonial rule at this point in time so if we take the mid-1830s, right, we're talking about roughly 7 decades, 7 to 8 decades. Okay, and again, that's somewhat inaccurate only because, so here's a map of India. I will show you some maps, by the way, in a PowerPoint presentation on Thursday, okay, including different, where the Indians are going and all of that. But here's a rough map of India. So this is eastern India, Bengal, right? And here's Calcutta, which would have been a major port, right? A major port. And then you've got Bombay over here, okay, right? And Delhi is over here in the north, right? Delhi is not at this point the capital. It's going to become the capital much later. Calcutta is where the British had established their supremacy. And we know that it's in the mid-18th century that the British won a battle. It's called the Battle of Plassey, and this marks the official inauguration of British rule in India. The British had a presence before that. They'd been there as traders, and they had set up a company. It's called the East India Company, right? The British are not the only people to do that. The French set up a trading company. The Dutch set up a company, the Dutch East India Trading Company. Right? So each of the major colonial powers had trading concerns, but the British, for reasons that we can't get into right now, because this is not a course now on the history of British India, but the British had established their supremacy, and it begins in Bengal, and then from 1757 onwards, what we're really talking about is the gradual expansion of British rule to other parts of India, right? So the period we're interested in now is the 1830s. We're trying to understand what are the socioeconomic conditions, political conditions in India at this point, at this juncture, in the 1830s. Because if you have the migration of well over 1 million people, close to 2 million people, right, from India, it means that there must have been either some incentives to these people or the socioeconomic conditions were rather dire. And I think that there's every reason to believe that they were rather dire. Right? So, for example, what was the prevalence of famine? Now, one interesting way to write the history of British India is to argue, as certainly some of the nationalists did, and I think that this narrative is fundamentally sound, that British rule in India is book-ended, right, by famines. That both in the beginning and at the end, you have major famines. So when the British took control of Bengal in the late 1750s, moving into the 1760s, in the late 1760s, you have a famine in Bengal which wipes out a third of the population of Bengal. 10 million people are wiped out. Okay? And then you have a famine which is going to take place in 1943. So this is 4 years before the independence of India. And again, that famine is going to be in Bengal. It's called the Great Bengal Famine of 1943, estimated to have killed about 3 million people. All right? So it's bookended. And again, if you look at the 19th century, what we're really speaking about is a situation where there is acute agrarian distress and unrest. Distress need not always lead to unrest, but you do have unrest. So in other words, there's distress because the prices of essential items, grain, for example, are deflated. The farmers aren't getting enough prices. On the other hand, you also have famine. You might have conditions of drought in other parts of the country. Right? So this is what I mean when I speak about distress. There's also resistance. That's the unrest. These are the conditions fundamentally that one is talking about. And again, we'd have to then look at, very detailed data, what were the unemployment rates? Of course, nobody was really generating this kind of data in the 1830s, right? You didn't have professional economists, generating this kind of data. But what we're suggesting is that there are conditions which can be viewed as amounting to conditions of dire distress for a substantial number of people living in the heartland. And when I say the heartland now, we're talking about this belt over here, okay? This belt over here, which today would be, so if you look at a modern map of India, this would be the states of Bihar and UP, okay? The states of Bihar and UP. Many of the migrants are going to come from this area over here. Predominantly a Hindi-speaking area, Hindi/Bhojpuri. There are a number of languages, related languages. So we can say Hindi, Bhojpuri belt over here. You're also going to have people who are going to be migrating. So these are the two big areas that they're migrating from. This area here, which is called the Madras Presidency. Okay, and there are going to be a fairly substantial number of Indians who are going to be recruited as indentured labor from this part. Right? So the language group that they represent now is Tamil. Right? That's a language group that they represent. There are also people who speak languages such as Telugu. Okay? And so on. Right? That's a broad picture now. Right? Now we are also saying, by the way, that there's a system. Let me add a few more components to this picture. There is a system of debt peonage. And when I say debt peonage, what I mean is that, and you can see some remnants of this even today, that in rural parts of India, rural indebtedness of farmers continues to be a problem. So, for example, it is estimated that in the last 15 to 20 years, 250,000 farmers in India have committed suicide. The vast bulk of them by drinking pesticide. Okay? And if you look at their lives, it's very clear that virtually all of them were severely in debt. Now, why do they get severely in debt? Well, the conditions today are very different than what they were in the 1830s. There may be some overlap there, and that some overlap may be that the farmer may take out a debt to get his daughter married off, because you have a dowry system. So when you want to get your daughter married off, you have to send her off with a dowry, right? And in order to get her married into a reasonably respectable family, that is a family of some standing, the dowry would have to be of a certain amount, right? Right? But that's not really what accounts. That may be one common element between the 1830s and, let's say, today. But that's not what accounts for the bulk of these suicides. What accounts for the bulk of these suicides today? So I'm giving you the example from today because it helps us to think about what may have been happening. What might have been the problems of the debt peonage for peasants in the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, 50s, right? So what accounts for the bulk of the suicides today is the introduction of such things as genetically modified cotton, okay, by transnational agro businesses such as Monsanto. Because when you introduce genetically modified cotton, the outputs and inputs change completely in agriculture. So when I say outputs and inputs, so what I'm referring to is, well, there's a certain amount of things that you need in order to be able to raise cotton, have a cotton farm, right? For example, the use of pesticides. What do they cost? Okay, the seeds, water, right? You're going to have to irrigate the land. Is this monsoon-fed irrigation or is this tube well irrigation? If it's tube well irrigation, then you have to dig the tube wells. That's cost money. So what's happening is that the costs for producing this genetically modified cotton vastly outweigh, right, what the farmer is going to get by way of his yield and profit at the end of the day, right? So 250,000 farmers committing suicide, one of the stories that is very seldom heard of in the West, is a huge number of people. Okay, and we're saying that similar conditions of debt were in fact making life quite difficult for the farmer, right? So that's a very broad picture of the socio-economic conditions in, let's say, North India in the 1820s moving into the decades thereafter. Okay, now let's shift the picture to the geopolitical considerations. The geopolitical consideration, the principal one, is the abolition of slavery in British-controlled territories around the world, right? Which occurs in the mid-1830s. Now, the consequences of this are that you have British-owned plantations, and these plantations are in such places as Jamaica, right? So we're looking at the Caribbean here. We're Trinidad and Barbados, right, and so on. Okay, there are also plantations in Suriname, which is Dutch Guyana. Suriname is actually the tip of Latin America, but it's considered part of the Caribbean, right? We're also talking about such places as Fiji, but Indian indentured labor to Fiji is going to begin much later than it does to this part of the world. And we're also talking about Indian Ocean world now, which would include Mauritius. That would be the principal colony over there, right? Now, what you have then are the following circumstances. That is, if you're looking at the picture going outside India and looking at it more geopolitically, what we're talking about is the expansion of the British Empire, number one. We're talking about the growth of, obviously, capitalism, right? And particularly what you might describe as the plantation economy, right? And these are mainly sugar plantations, not entirely. So in the Belgian Congo, it was rubber plantations, right? As in Malaysia, it was rubber plantations, not sugar plantations. Right? And Indian indentured labor to Malaysia will also begin later than it does to these parts of the world. Here we're talking about largely sugar plantations. All right? So when you have the abolition of slavery, the plantation owners immediately are concerned about who is in fact actually going to be working there. Because when black men and women become free, they are going to raise the price of their labor. And so the concern that was uppermost in the minds of the plantation owners, as indeed is the case with any capitalist down to the present day, is how do you maximize your profits? Right? How do you ensure a labor supply, a relatively constant labor supply, right? And try to maximize your profits. Now, of course, India was the largest colony that the British had at this juncture. Continued to be the largest colony that they ever had. And so one of the things that these plantation owners is going to do is that they are going to put pressure on the colonial state to allow the export of Indians' indentured labor. Right? And I'll explain what indentured means in a moment, but allow the export of Indian labor. So the other thing that we have to think about is the international labor market. Right? And that's a consideration that, again, persists down to the present day. There's an international labor market, even today. You know, Filipino nurses, for example. I mean, ever thought about it, right? That, you know, no matter where you go, you're going to find Filipino nurses or nurses from the state of Kerala. Right? Certain ethnic groups have a certain niche almost in this. So what we have here is a international labor market which provides the context for this, in addition to such things as the abolition of slavery, the growth of capitalism, obviously the expansion of the British Empire. And then, of course, one of the questions that we could ask is, why would the Indian government permit Indians to go? But you could easily ask, why would they not permit them to go? Right? In other words, if the idea is that, look, it's our own Englishmen who are running these plantations, it's going to lead to the growth of the British economy. All right? And, of course, the British Empire as a whole. On the other hand, one could argue that there might have been reasons which, in fact, stopped the Indian government from giving its assent to the idea that Indians should be sent out. So, for example, in the 1830s, exactly at this same time, the Indian government is actually thinking about the massive production of sugar as an export item from India. Now, that's going to bring it into competition with these plantation owners. Right? So we're going to find that this Indian indentured labor system is not a system without some hiccups once in a while. That is that, you know, it starts and then it stops because there's pressure being placed on the Indian government, right, to not allow Indians to be exported to these places. But notwithstanding these hiccups, the system is going to continue until it is finally brought to a halt effectively in 1917, with the exception of such places as Malaysia, where it's going to continue, you know, for several more decades, right? But that was a different system, you know. So what is the Indian indentured labor system that one speaks of is as a whole is brought to a halt in 1917. All right. So these are the broader considerations. Does anybody have any questions up till this point in time about anything that I've said about, you know, what is it that we are thinking? What is it that we need to think about when we speak of Indian indentured labor? All right. Now let me just give you some figures before we get into the nitty-gritty. Right? When I say figures, you know, how many people are we talking about? So Mauritius, okay, 453,000 Indians left from Mauritius. And Mauritius is not China. I mean, it's not like a place with a massive population. The 453,000 meant effectively that the Indians became the dominant ethnic racial group in Mauritius. So if you look at Mauritius today, right, the majority of the population is Indian. The majority of the population. Most of the Indians are Hindi speakers, Hindi, Bhojpuri speakers, although the official language is a French Creole in And so there's a whole interesting set of questions, you know, what is the role of language in linking together parts of the diaspora. Because there's not one language here. If you were coming from South India, then you would be speakers predominantly of Tamil and Telugu. And Mohandas Gandhi, right, who goes to South Africa, becomes aware of the intricacies of this question, because when he goes to South Africa as a lawyer, right, in the early 1890s, and then he's going to continue to stay on in South Africa, as some of you know, for over 20 years. And one of the things he's going to find out when he begins to organize the Indians, right, who are going to be trying to resist the oppression of the colonial state, not the apartheid government, because the system of apartheid comes in much later on, officially, right? But there is obviously a colonial state here, right? And there is obviously a racial hierarchy, a very rigid racial hierarchy, which is going to be institutionalized into what becomes known as the apartheid system later on. Now, when he arrives in South Africa, Mohandas Gandhi, right, and begins to think eventually about how he's going to organize the Indians, the first problem he runs into is language. That there are Tamil speakers, Telugu speakers, Gujarati speakers. That's not a problem, because Gandhi himself is a native Gujarati, right? There are Hindi speakers, Malayali speakers. So Malayalam is a language which is spoken over here in the state of Kerala, you know, right? And there's a whole bunch of languages. So if you're going to organize people, well, what is the language you're going to use? Is there a common language? It's an interesting problem, right? But that's an aside, because I'm describing to you, right, very briefly, right, this overall picture, and I'm saying, okay, let's look at some numbers. So Mauritius, 453,000 Indians go to Mauritius, about 240,000 to British Guyana, okay, 144,000 to Trinidad, 36,000 to Jamaica. I'm just rounding off the numbers, obviously. 152,000 to Natal. Natal is part of South Africa, right? Okay, because at that point the Union of South Africa had not been established. And in fact, it's the 150th anniversary of last year of the arrival of Indians in Natal. All right, so most of them are going to settle in you know, eventually in places such as Durban. There is actually an Indian community there today called Chatsworth, which has a population of approximately 300,000. All right, one of the largest Indian diasporic communities in the world. Right, 26,000 to Reunion, 61,000 to Suriname, 32,000 to East Africa, which includes today Kenya, Uganda, you know, Tanzania, right? So these are the numbers, yes?
And all of these numbers are late 19th century?
No, total numbers.
Total numbers.
Yeah, total number of Indians who went to Mauritius, for example, under the Indian indentured labor system. I'm not giving you the population of Indians in Mauritius, I'm giving you the total number of people who left India for Mauritius under the Indian indentured labor system, and likewise for all the other figures. Total number of Indians who left. This is documented figures. Now, you know, because you look at the ship's registers, right? I mean, there is a system, right? There is a system. So, and I think that the numbers are reasonably accurate. I mean, there may be some people who are unaccounted for, but I think these are reasonably accurate figures. You know, question?
You said Jamaica.
Yeah.
It's really quickly answer me, but my understanding that there's no, doesn't seem like there's a real noticeable Jamaican Indian community anymore.
Today, yes, that is correct. That is correct. Yeah, you notice the figures for 36,000 as opposed to 145,000 for Trinidad. Smaller number. There is a community. It's scattered. And because the numbers are too small for them to have the kind of political clout that they came to have in places such as Trinidad. I mean, you know, I didn't give you numbers here, by the way, for example, for Barbados, because it's even smaller than the number of Indians who went to Jamaica. So the impression that you have that the Indians are not a significant force, I would simply qualify by saying not a significant political force, because in order to have a certain kind of political visibility, numbers obviously make a difference. Not always. We have to be very careful that we don't assume that numbers always make that difference. I mean, a good example would be the Parsis, Okay, and again, this is not an aside because it will help us understand something about the problem which I think is endemic in the literature and is not being seriously addressed because it's become naturalized way of thinking about the world. And that is a problem of thinking about majorities and minorities. This is a relatively recent way of thinking about groups. It's a modern form of political arithmetic. Of course, the idea of a majority and minority becomes important partly because of the advent of electoral democracy. See, when you have electoral democracy, right, then the idea of majority and minority becomes important because minority groups, as it were, can become important voting blocks, right? But I'm saying to you that there are people, and this is where the Parsis come in, a very good illustration. There are people who may have been numerical minorities, but never thought of themselves as such. That is, never thought of themselves as minorities psychologically. So the Parsis are a very good example. Who are the Parsis? So the Parsis are people of Zoroastrian descent who fled Iran when Islam became the dominant religion. And they came to India 1,000 years ago. Okay? The Parsis are very small in number. Very, very small in number. But, and when I say very small, I mean I'm talking about minuscule, not even a fraction of 1% of the population of a country as huge as India. Okay? But they became astronomically important. And one good illustration of that is their role in the development of what was, and some people would say still is, the greatest metropolis in India, namely the city of Bombay. Right? Because the Parsis were what were called comprador capitalists, so they were the middlemen. And sometimes their role was not that great. It was a problem because, for example, the city of Bombay was built on the back of the opium trade. No question about it. And the Parsis had a huge role to play in that opium trade between India and Canton. Okay? Right? But, so what I'm saying is that they're numerically very small, but psychologically they never thought of themselves as a minority. They acted with the confidence of people who rule the world. All right? Whereas you could have people who form part of a majority, but psychologically feel themselves to be a minority. Right? So we have to think very carefully about simply assuming that majority and minority are given categories that we can always work with. Right? But with respect to your question about Jamaica, there's no question that the Indians are not only a numerical minority, okay, but that they don't have the confidence that would have led them, let's say, to occupy the same role, okay, that the Parsis did in India. And then again, the historical conditions were vastly different, right?
It does seem that there's still some cultural influence. I know there's curry goat.
Oh yeah. Of course. I mean, all over the Caribbean, the influence of Indian food on the development of the cuisine is quite significant. Yeah. All right. But that's something that we will provisionally take up later on. All right. So what I've done here hitherto up till this point in time is give you some figures now, right? And let me now get into some of the details about the indentured system. Okay. So one of the things that you've already been told now is where these people were recruited from. Okay. Now we have to get into the question of how were they recruited? Was there a system by which this recruitment was regulated? Right? So let me numerically list the questions serially. Right? Where were they recruited from? Number one. What strata of life, and that would mean socioeconomic categories such as caste, class, religion, right? Are they predominantly Hindus? Are there a good number of Muslims? Does it vary from country to country? So if you look at the Gulf countries today, for example, the South Asian laborers that you find in Dubai are overwhelmingly Muslim. right? And the obvious reason for that is that these are staunchly Muslim countries, right? So they prefer to have laborers coming from India who are of Muslim background. I mean, if you go to Kerala today, the countryside of Kerala has been completely transformed. And one of the reasons it's been transformed is that the Muslims who have come back, with Gulf money, right? Okay? Petrodollars, as it were, right? They've built huge mosques. And you see these mosques are not in the indigenous Kerala style any longer, many of them, of architecture. It's a very different kind of architecture, and they dominate the landscape sometimes, right? So, but again, different set of questions. That has to do with remittances from abroad. How does the landscape in India itself get transformed, etc., etc., right? So, serially the questions are, okay, who were the Indians who were being recruited, and where were they being recruited from? Number two, what were the procedures used to recruit these Indians? Number three, what was the system of regulation? Right? Was this regulated by the Indian government? It had to be regulated to some degree. Right? And again, we're not going to be able to delve into all the details because there's a substantial amount of detail and it would vary from time to time and from port to port. Right? Then number four, we'd have to look at the nature of the contract. Okay? And that in some ways is the simplest if you're looking at this system here. The Indians are going to go to Malaysia, it's going to be a little bit different. But I'm going to give you the general picture there. Right? So let's answer this question in some detail before we get back to the others. What is the nature of the contract? The nature of the contract is, it's a 5-year contract usually. So the person who's being recruited, the laborer, let's just call him the laborer, okay? And incidentally, overwhelmingly male, over 90% male, right? Very few women. Okay, but this is, by the way, this is where the system differs from slavery, because in slavery, under the system of slavery, there was a deliberate attempt, and it wasn't simply an attempt, it was almost always successful, to break up the families. Right? To break up the families. And as you know, most slaves eventually came to acquire the surname of the owner, the master. And that's, of course, the rebellion of Malcolm X. What is that X? Right? I don't want to take the name of, the person who was the owner of my ancestors. Okay? This was not the case with indentured. It's not so much the case, it's not really the case that there was an attempt made to break up Indian families. No, one can't really argue that. That's one big distinction between these two systems. It's just that the labor was overwhelmingly male for lots of reasons, one of which has to do with, typically that's the nature of migration. Okay, in the 19th century, even I would say down to the present day. Yeah, I think the numbers are not so lopsided today. Okay, but if you're going to look at, for example, people who are going to cross the desert from Mexico, take a risk and come over to the US, it's going to be largely men. And then if they eventually get regularized, as it were, okay, right, settle down, then eventually you build a family. Okay, and of course this created various problems. So when you have a huge number of men, very few women, obviously one of the problems has to do with sexual tensions. Okay, availability of women. Right? And what kind of particular problems did this lead to in the plantation? And how were these problems eventually addressed or not addressed? All right? But we have to leave that until much later on, because at this point we're saying, what was the contract? So the contract was a 5-year contract. The laborer would get free passage to Trinidad, Guyana, wherever. Free passage at the end of the 5th year, according to the original terms of the contract. And there are modifications, by the way, that are introduced in the contract later on. But at the end of that 5th year, the laborer would be given free passage back to India if he or she desired. And that raises another set of questions, and that is, how many Indians eventually went back? Right? How many of them eventually went back? From places such as Trinidad, very few. Partly because of the length of the passage. How long does it take, by the way? In the 1830s, to get from India to Trinidad, you think? Right? I mean, talking about a week, 10 days? No. Well over a month. Well over a month. You know? Very long distance, the British Caribbean from India. 2-3 months. Not uncommon at all. Okay? That's the length of the passage. Okay? So, question number 4 here was, what's the nature of the contract? 5 years, and you're offered free passage. Now, if you do not opt to go back, you can renew your contract for another 5 years. Right? And usually, many of the laborers would do so because 5 years, for people like them, coming from the social background they came from, okay, with the means available to them, which were very little, it was not enough period of time to be able to establish themselves independently and say, I'm going to buy my way out of the contract. Okay? So usually they would renew it for another 5 years. And again, there was a possibility of a free passage back, or there could be another incentive because, of course, the plantation owner has to give an incentive to the person if he's going to renew for another 5 years. And that might be that, well, after the end of the 10 years, you're permitted to stay, and you might even be given a certain sum of money to help you get by on your own feet. You know, establish a small little garden, for example. You grow your own vegetables and then start selling them in the free market. Okay? And as I said, there were various kinds of modifications. So, for example, in Mauritius in 1847, these laborers were offered an incentive of £2 to stay on. That's the incentive I was talking about. Okay? £2 sounds like a pittance, but of course £2 in 1847 is a bit more than we can imagine today, right? It is still an exceedingly small amount. Okay? So you could stay on, accept that incentive of £2 and renounce your right to a free passage back. You wouldn't get a free passage back, so if you decided, right, at some point in the 6th, 7th, 8th year, 10th year, you know, usually you wouldn't be allowed to break your contract, so if it was a renewal for a 5 year, then it would be at the end of the 10th year that you would be heading back to India, you would no longer get the free passage. All right? Now, after 1852, this free return passage was going to be offered only after 10 years. So in other words, the initial contract of 5 years was changed to 10 years, that if you wanted the free passage back, you would have to sign the initial contract for 10 years. You could sign it for 5 years, but you wouldn't get a free passage back to India. Okay? So there are these kinds of modifications. Now this system, by the way, this modification of 1852 is discontinued after 1858 because they found that they couldn't get enough people to come. Right? If these people were told that, look, we'll only give you your passage back free to India if you stay for 10 years. 10 years was too long a period of time. You know, right? So they discontinued this particular modification in 1858. Right? And as I said, there are variations to the contract. I'm just giving you the general outlines of what this contract might be like. Yes?
Who facilitated these passages? Was it the British government? Was it
plantation owners? Plantation owners. They paid a bounty. Okay, so for the case of Mauritius, this goes back to the first set of questions which I haven't answered yet, right? Because I said, what were the circumstances under which they were recruited? Who recruited them, right? Where did they come from, so forth and so on. But to answer your question, right? So for example, at one point in time, the British plantation owners are going to offer a bounty of £21. Who are they going to offer the £21? To the recruiter. Right? You get me a person who's willing to come on this ship and come all the way to Trinidad or British Guyana, and I'm going to pay you £21. Yeah. Okay? So it's the plantation owners. With or without, as it were, a subsidy from the colonial state. Okay? Right? But usually it's the plantation owners because they're the ones who obviously want this labor in order to be able to continue with their plantation. All right? And let me just really finish with the question. So then the contract, and then we have the question of the middle passage, ship. So is there an adequate supply of water and food on the ship? Okay? are there adequate health facilities? If you're talking about a 2-3 month passage, and many of these Indians, by the way, who are being recruited, particularly the North Indians from here, these are people who really have not seen a body of water, unless it be something like a river, the Ganga, or a smaller river, wherever they're coming from. They've never been to the coast, right? Seasickness was common. It could be common even for a veteran traveler, but if you were coming from the interior of India, right, and you thought, well, hey, maybe I'm, going to go somewhere which is going to take me a day or two, and then you end up on a ship for 2 to 3 months, right? Various health problems are going to arise. So these are, as I said, all very detailed questions. I mean, there are people who have written entire doctoral dissertations, on the question of what kind of health facilities were available or not on these ships. Okay? So there's this whole question of the Middle Passage. Then we're not yet finished with the serial list of questions of this. So once they arrive, then the question is, where do they stay? Right? You've got a shipload of 500,000 people, 1,000 people, where are they going to stay? And the answer there, by the way, is quite simple in some respects. Usually they stayed in the same places where the slaves had formerly stayed. In Fiji, this has been well documented. So it was the same quarters, effectively, right? And this would be on the plantation itself. And then there'd be the question of, well, how does the indenture system now work on the plantation now? Okay, is there a system of overseers, right? Is there a quota that is established, right? What are the penalties if you do not meet the quota? So when I'm saying quota, for example, if you were working on a sugar plantation, so you have to cut down, let's say, I'm giving you a random figure, 500 kilograms of sugar cane, right? That's what you do, right? You would cut down the sugar cane. This would, in the 1830s, you wouldn't have mechanized farming. There would be no tractors. So this is going to be hard body physical labor, right? So this is a quota that is set. What if you don't meet the quota? Okay, who has authority over you to inflict punishment? So forth and so on. So these are the kinds of details that we're really talking about. Now let's go back to the first of these questions, right? And of course I'm going to continue with this in my next lecture, but the first set of questions here have to do with who are these people? Well, I've given you some hint. We're talking about people coming largely from this belt over here, what is today called the Bihar UP belt, okay? Bhojpuri / Hindi speakers, some coming from South India. It's going to vary quite a bit. The ones who go to the British Caribbean, the bulk of them are really coming from the Bhojpuri, okay, belt. And when you get to South Africa, you're going to find that there are people from there, but there are also a considerable number of people from South India, from the Madras Presidency. All right. So, and in the case of Malaysia, it's going to be people who are largely from South India, partly because of the proximity, right? So this is India over here, and then Southeast Asia over here, right? The Malay archipelago over here. Right? So, and it also means, by the way, that the people who come to Malaysia from India, many of them are going to go back. So the percentage of people who go back is much greater than it is for people who go to places such as Fiji, Trinidad, and so on. And that partly, of course, has to do with the distance as well. All right? So they're being recruited from the interior here, and there will be some people coming from South India. Now, if you look at the reading, there's an optional reading that you were given by Kumpston. He has very substantial detail, okay? And in the early pages of the reading that you have, in fact, he even argues that a substantial number of these people were kidnapped. I think that argument, by the way, is no longer really accepted, which is not to say that some were not, but it's not generally viewed to be the case that most of these people were really kidnapped, okay? What is true is that many of them were induced to go under false pretense. Many of them didn't have the slightest idea where they were going to go to. Okay? The likelihood that any of them had a geographical conception of this world, okay, right, is, I think, minimal, okay, virtually zero. So when I say false pretense, now what I mean is a number of different things. You're being taken from, let's say, the interior, okay, you're in search of employment, right? A recruiting agent comes to you, or someone else comes to you who's been sent by the recruiting agent and says that, look, I can get you a job in the city of Calcutta. Okay, and so if you read the coolitude, that the reading that I put on, the Torah Buli for this week, which gives you a number of these life stories, the circumstances under which people were sent. Somebody says that I'm going to find you a job in Calcutta. So this person is going to move from the interior. That, by the way, is already a bit of a novelty for this person, right? Because to go from, let's say, eastern Bihar to Calcutta, well, that's several hundred miles right there. Okay, and in the 1830s, before the advent of trains, right? There are no railway journeys at this point in time. After the 1850s and 1860s, the movement of people to the ports is going to be somewhat easier because some of them are going to be able to undertake train journeys. This is going to be a journey by road, which would really mean a journey by bullock cart. That's what it would mean. Or by walking. All right? So we're already talking about several weeks. Several weeks. Right? This person comes to Calcutta, and then in Calcutta the person is told that, well, the job is no longer there. It's disappeared because it took you too long to come for this job. But I have another job for you, says a recruiting agent. I have another job for you, and it means traveling across the seas. So by the way, you'll encounter a phrase called kalapani. Okay? Well, kalapani, literally, by the way, the word kala means black, and pani is water. Kalapani is black water. So, according to the literature, right, I'll end with this thought, and then we'll continue the narrative. According to the literature, according to, for example, colonial narratives as well, most Indians would not cross the Kalapani. They would not cross the Kalapani, that is a large body of water, a sea, an ocean, because if you did so, you would lose your caste. Right? You'd become outcasted. Right? And by the way, there are all kinds of technical details, and that's why you must do the reading for this week, the Torah Buli, particularly the Coolitude anthology. Because some of the people interviewed there, who did this passage, they say that, well, we ate only, okay, uncooked food and grains. And you might think to yourself, what's the significance of that? Why not just have baked chicken or whatever? Well, no. It's a huge difference because if you want to keep your caste, you have to be sure that you do not get contaminated. Cooked food contaminates much more than uncooked food. Okay? So that's one reason. And so uncooked food includes fruits, vegetables, but you're not going to get a supply of fresh fruits and vegetables on a 2-3 month journey. So it would basically mean grain. Okay? And this idea that Indians would not cross the Kalapani is an idea that becomes firmly entrenched in the literature. However, we need to question it. Because one of the things I've been trying to suggest to you is that there has always been substantial mobility of Indians going overseas. Okay? So we might say that, well, perhaps there were certain caste taboos or restrictions. Some people feared the loss of caste. And the people who are going to fear the loss of caste are the ones who are upper caste. The higher up you are, the social ladder in the caste system, the greater the number of taboos. I mean, if you're down the social ladder there are no taboos. You enjoy life. Eat beef, eat this, eat that, drink alcohol, indulge in tobacco and sex, whatever. If you're, I'm putting it very generally. The higher up you are, the greater the number of taboos, because the greater the number of sources that might contaminate you. Right? So, one question here is this idea of the Kalapani, that you, by crossing, okay, you would get contaminated. Well, how prevalent was this, right? And the relationship to all this that I'm saying here, because remember what we're talking about, the question we're talking about is, this man, A, is brought under false pretense to Calcutta. And then he's told that there's a job for him in Calcutta, then he finds out there isn't, and then he's going to have to now cross the seas, go to some unknown terrain that he knows nothing about, right? Right? And there may or may not be the fear of the loss of caste for this person. What is certainly very clear, if we go by the numbers, is that a great number of people were willing to lose their caste, right? Which tells us something about the social strata that they come from, right? That's the relationship of this to the larger question. So we're going to stop here and then continue the narrative on Thursday.